Hi, I'm Lucy from Sew Essential and I'm here today to give you a tutorial on how to sew piping and specifically give you lots of tips of how to pipe seams. So everything I talk about today is available on our lovely website and you'll find links to all the products I mentioned below. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe because every Friday I bring you a video packed full of sewing goodness. And if you can't wait a whole week, do jump on and check out our social media accounts. We're in all the usual places and I've linked those below. So today's video, I'm going to show you how to pipe and specifically how to pipe seams. So I've got some examples here for you. I've got a pair of shorts on today where I've added piping in the seam around the waistband and also around the waist, and you can see at the back there as well. And it just gives things a really lovely, unique little bit of detail, can highlight certain features on the pattern. And I've got some more examples here to show you as well. There's a beautiful dress that Angela made with piped princess seams. And then you can also pipe around necklines and armholes as well. Another example of a lovely dress here with the satin piping around the neckline and armholes there. So that's just to give you some ideas. The other place that it's used a lot as well is on home deck projects, piping around cushions and that sort of thing, and it can just give your projects that really truly unique look, but also make them look a bit more high-end as well, just having those special little details. But the trick with piping is to be accurate and for it to be even all the way along. So I've got lots and lots of tips in this video for how you can achieve great results every time. I'll talk you through my top tips for getting nice even piping, sewing piping round curves, how to tackle that, how to tackle where seams cross on a garment so that you don't end up with lots of bulk. Lots and lots of tips for you, and everything I mentioned in the video, piping feet, bias binding, piping cord, they're all available on our lovely website, so do check those links out below. Just a mention as well that piping feet, we do them for a wide range of brands of machine, Brother Janome, Elna, Pfaff and Husqvarna, but do always check our compatibility charts on the website to make sure that the part is compatible with your make and model of machine. And if you've got any queries at all, just drop us an email. We're always more than happy to help. So let's get on now with the tutorial. A piping foot is a great way to sew piping into garments, home deck projects, bags, lots of different things you can do it with, and it just adds a lovely high-end additional detail to things and makes things truly unique. You know, you could be sewing the same pattern as somebody else but adding this own little unique twist of yours. And the piping feet come in a variety of different sizes and types. So here I've got a clear piping foot, a metal piping foot and a mini piping foot, which all fit my Husqvarna Brilliant 75Q machine. We do stock them for a range of machines including Brother, Janome, Husqvarna and Pfaff, so check out the links below if you've got a different model or make. But they come in different sizes, and essentially the principle of these feet is that they have a little groove along the bottom of the foot, which you can see there, and the piping sits inside that groove as you sew. And it just keeps everything in place and keeps it really accurate, because if you are going to add piping to a garment, especially a contrasting piping, which is probably what you're going to go for, you know, it will be very visible, it will draw the eye to that detail, which is a good thing because it's making it lovely and unique. But for that reason you want accuracy, and you can use a zipper foot to sew piping into things and it can work really well, but the piping foot's really helpful for things like going round corners and just maintaining that accuracy as you sew. So to sew piping you use a bias binding. You can either create your own bias binding or you can use a ready-made, and the reason you use bias binding is because it's cut on the bias, so it will be able to work around corners. And I've just got some ready-made bias here, which comes pre-folded. This is available on our site, because normally if you're attaching bias to a garment, you encase the seam like so, so that's why it's folded the way it is. However, for piping, you just need to press that open like I've done here. And I'm using a 2.5mm binding, but you can use different widths, just depends what suits you and what pattern and what purpose you're using it for. But I've got a nice wide one here that just gives me plenty to work with. If you are piping a seam, so cushions and things like that are another great example. I've got some at home, they look so pretty with the contrasting piping. But just cut your binding and your cord longer than the seam so that you've got room for manoeuvre, and you've got a bit of overhang at the end. Also, it is advisable to just cut your piping cord slightly longer than your binding as well, so that you can have it sticking out at the end like that, because that will enable you to, first of all, not lose the piping as you sew, because sometimes when you first start sewing that could disappear inside the binding, but also just when you come to finish off the ends and reduce any bulk, there's a little tip I'll give you later, and it just makes it easier if you can grab hold of the piping. So that's my top tip for that. Now with this, you could just sew your piping straight into the seam. So you could position your piping down the centre of the wrong side of the binding, fold the binding over, and then you could get your fabric for your seam and you could position it like so. You could either sew it straight onto that first layer, or you could go one step further and you could even put your second layer of fabric on top and stitch straight into the seam. So you'd stitch along the piping and it would be in place like so. However, for real accuracy, I personally think it's worth just taking a few extra steps, a little bit of extra time, just to get things spot on. And what I like to do first of all is to just sew the piping into the binding first, and then I attach it to the garment. And I like to do it in 3 steps. I like to attach it to one side first and then sew the seam for the final step. And it's just because I said, you know, accuracy is key here. It's great if it's even and accurate and neat, especially seeing as piping is going to draw your eye to that area. Now, one thing you need to consider if you do this extra step is that when you sew your seam, you don't want to see the original line of stitches where you've sewn the piping into the binding before attaching it to the other fabric. So what I've done here is I've just taken some tailor's chalk and marked the edge of the piping so I can see that's where I want my final line of stitches to be, so that when I sew the piping into the binding now, I can position my needle just to the right of that so that the first line of stitches will be hidden. I've now got the clear piping foot on the machine. I'm using a 2mm polyester cord, and actually a piping cord. Something that's worth mentioning here is if you're using a cotton piping cord, you will need to wash it and pre-shrink it first. I'm using a polyester one, so that doesn't need to be pre-shrunk. I've got my little mark there that I've just explained to you, and I've folded the binding around the piping, and then I'm just going to make sure I get the piping positioned in that groove. So I haven't got that right the first time, just move it over a little bit and I can see that's nice and secure in there now. And then I just need to look at my needle position, because I just want to stitch just to the right of where I'm going to be stitching when I sew the seam. So I'm just going to move my needle position across so I can see I'm just the other side of that marking where I want to be when I finally sew the seam. And needle positions are something that you get on most computerized machines these days. I really highly recommend a machine with multiple needle positions. It's great for tasks like this, and also sewing bias binding, sewing zips, all that sort of thing. If you've got any queries, just get in touch with us because we stock a wide range of machines. But let's get going now and just sew this piping into the binding. So you can see there it's sewing it nice and accurately, an equal distance from the edge of the piping where I started, just making sure it stays in that little groove. And as you work your way down, just reposition everything, make sure your edges are meeting up nice and accurately on your binding. If you're an underconfident sewer or a beginner, you could even pin this in place if you prefer, if you're not confident doing it the way I'm doing it. But just keep making sure those raw edges line up and stitch your way to the end of the binding. And you can see there the piping is sewn in lovely and accurately. It's nice and even, so we've got off to a great start there, and then I can show you how we insert that into the seam and sew it into the main garment or cushion or project fabric. To sew the actual seam, I'm going to show you a straight seam first of all, and I'm going to position the binding so that the raw edges match up with the raw edges of the fabric. And then I thought it'd just be useful to show you the different methods I talked about. So in this example, I'm going to sandwich all of the layers and sew them all at the same time so that you can see an example with that. Now you could just put that straight under the machine. I've just got the binding lining up with the raw edges of the fabric. The fabric's obviously right sides together. You could just pop that under your machine now and go. But if you're not that confident and you're just concerned about the accuracy, you could of course just pin everything in place, or you could use some clips like these clover clips that I'm using here. We stock these on our website, clover versions and prim versions, and they're quite handy for these sorts of tasks. Or if you're working with a fabric where you don't want to leave marks on it, such as I've used them before on faux leather and that sort of thing, where pins will leave marks, they're quite handy for that sort of thing as well. So I'm just clipping that in place to secure everything. And now the only problem with doing it with this method, of course, as well, is that you can't see that original line of stitching that you did, so you can't be sure that you're encasing those original stitches within the seam. Whereas if you do one layer first and attach the binding to one layer of fabric first, when you sew the second layer, you'll then be able to use that line of stitching so that you can be accurate and see where those stitches are. So that's just something to bear in mind, another reason really for taking those extra steps and being extra careful and accurate. But let's just try and position this now with our clear foot. That feels like I've got the piping in the groove there. Now I know that I moved my needle position previously 2 to the right, so I'm going to move it 2 to the left now, and that should get me in the right place and should encase those original stitches. I can just remove these clips, but actually I can probably sew past them in most parts. So again, you can see everything's just feeding nicely through the piping foot. Need to remove that one. I'll pop links to all the little tools and things that I've used in the video as well, so that you can find them. They're all available on our website. And the nice thing about this as well is I'm not having to think about the markings on my needle plate. I'm literally just using the foot Obviously if you're sewing with a set seam allowance, you need to just check that you're sewing at the right seam allowance. I haven't worried about this on these examples, but that's relatively straightforward. It's just making sure you're positioning everything so that if you want to sew a 5/8 seam, your final line of stitching will be at 5/8 from the raw edge. It's really easy, it's just feeding it through. I'm not having to really think about where it is, it's just doing all the work for me. Okay, so reached the end of the seam there, so let's have a look now. Oh, doesn't that look lovely? Look at that, it's so pretty. So you can see we've got lovely even piping there, a lovely pop of pink that stands out, makes whatever this project might be really unique and different, and it just looks really nice and even. And then I would obviously trim and grade my seams in the usual way. If you're sewing a curved seam, like a princess seam perhaps, or round a corner on a cushion or something, or a neckline or armhole, it's definitely important that you take some additional steps. And also, I would say it's definitely preferable that you stitch it onto one side of the fabric first, then attach the final piece of fabric. But the first step that you need to take is you need to clip the binding. So the bias binding will move around curves, but obviously once you've inserted the piping into it, that makes everything more rigid, so it won't move as freely as it did before you inserted the piping. If you can see there, it's not curving, it's sort of puckering a little bit, and it's not going to sit very well in your curved seam. So what I've done here is I've just taken snips just to the stitching line about every quarter of an inch or so, and that then allows the piping to curve beautifully and it will sit really nicely on that seam. And then, as I said, for accuracy, I would just position it on a single layer of fabric first of all, and I would pin it in place more than likely, or use my little clips that I showed you. Because sometimes pinning when you've clipped the binding can be a bit awkward, because obviously you pin a enter through one piece of binding and then come out through the other. These little clips are quite handy because you can be a bit more selective about where you secure everything. So yeah, I'd just get that in position, sew this first layer, and then worry about attaching it or attaching the second layer. Okay, so let's just finish that curve off actually so you can see properly. Just bear with me while I grab a few extra clips. Okay, so you can see that's curving nicely now around there. So we'll just take it under the foot again in exactly the same way. I've got my needle position, I think, where I need it, because this was the same strip of binding that I used for the other seam that I demonstrated. I sewed it all in one initially and then cut it into pieces for the different seams. Don't think I've quite got it in the groove there. That feels better. Okay, and I can see I can just use my hand wheel to just check the needle position, and yep, that's fine. That's going to sew just to the left of that original stitching line. So I'm just going to remove that first clip and get going. And you can see I'm just stitching just the other side of that original stitching line there. If you're going around tight corners, needle up down on your machine will come in really handy here. It's where you can stop with your needle in the down position, manoeuvre your fabric and carry on around the corner. And I use that all the time, even when I'm just sewing normal corners without any piping. It's a really useful feature to have on a sewing machine. And again, you know, if you ever need to talk to us about any of your options, just drop us an email. I'll pop links below to our sewing machine pages as well. But I'll just carry on around the curve now. And you can see there we've got lovely neat piping attached. You can see the original line of stitching where we secured the piping, and then the second line of stitching which is going to attach it to the fabric. And you can see there that that piping again is lovely and neat and accurate and will move beautifully around that curve. So if that was a princess seam, for example, you know, you've got a lovely neat curve there. Now when you sew the next line of stitching, as I mentioned, you could use this line of stitching as a guide. You could sew from that side if you wanted to, so that you could sew accurately and make sure you were sewing on top of that line of stitches, so that, you know, all the stitches are hidden. But yeah, you would just now put your next piece of fabric over the top and stitch that in place. However, something else to mention is that now perhaps you might want to snip these curves on the actual fabric, because if you're attaching that, if you're doing a princess seam or a curved seam, you might need to snip the fabric to get the two pieces of fabric to match up. So all you would do in that case is just lift the binding up like so, and you would just take your scissors and just snip your fabric in the usual way that you would when you were doing a princess seam or something similar. Just make those snips just to the line there, and then you would be able to work that fabric and position it in the usual way, and when it was all sewn together you would be left with that lovely neat piping. When I mentioned at the start of the video about leaving some excess piping poking out, it's because it will stop it from being eaten up into the piping as you sew, but it's also because if you need to cross a seam with your piping, obviously this is going to be bulky when you cross that seam. Or I'm making a pair of shorts at the moment, and the piping will finish and then I'll need to sew a zip down here for the centre back because I'm doing piping around the waist, and obviously I don't want that bulk there where the zip's going to be. So what I've done is I've just marked where the binding ends there and where the seam ends, and then I just need to pull it and snip about 5/8 off. And if I do that, what that will mean is that then this bit, this last 5/8 of the piped seam, will be flat and it will just be fabric and it won't be bulky. And then when I come to sew that zip or I cross that seam with another piped seam, it won't be bulky and it will sit lovely and flat and look really professional. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. As I mentioned at the start of the video, everything I mentioned is available on our website. You can find links to all the products on our website below. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.